Here's a drawing that Dr. Humes made, presumably without the help of the photographs or x-rays, but I'd like to point out that this is another wound slightly above the EOP, and there's bone intervening between it and the large defect at the top of the skull. The HSCA incorporates the entry hole at the edge of the large defect. Here again is another one. This is on the skin surface, but entry hole slightly above the EOP with bone or intervening between it and the large defect at the top rear, well, at the rear of the, on the right side of the head, excuse me. Here's a skull that was marked by them for the forensic pathology panel. Just remember that this is 15 years after the assassination. 3 different people marked this skull, and there is tremendous unanimity about where this bullet entered. Not up here, down here. And remember, these were the fellows who had the skull in their hands.
Dr. Bodden says there was no hole where Humes, Boswell, and Fink said there was. How do we know, how can we be confident that there was? First of all, there was internal beveling. This was noted by all 3 pathologists, but recall that Dr. Fink arrived late in the proceeding, late in the evening, after the brain had been removed. The removal of the brain necessitated the removal of bone at the site of the vertex where the HSCA panel said the entrance wound was, and yet Dr. Fink described in detail his examination of internal beveling at the site of the entrance wound in the skull. He could not have been talking about the higher wound referred to by the Clark panel and the HSCA panel because the bone and the brain in that area had already been removed by the time he arrived. And so these 3 doctors, Humes is now deceased, but all 3 of them, whenever questioned about this, agreed as to the location of the internal beveling that they examined. We also had witnesses, as I showed you, Roy Kellerman, Richard Lipsey, and the drawing that was done by Rydberg at the behest of Humes, which further corroborates the location. Dr. Bodden also has argued that because the cerebellum was intact, the wound could not have been at the lower location identified by Humes, Boswell, and Fink. We can answer this by resort to an MRI, and I'll come back to these. This is an MRI that was made by Dr. Robertson, and it shows that the bullet, if it behaved as Humes, Boswell, and Fink had it, would have entered 2 centimeters above the cerebellum, and the distance would have increased as the bullet transversed the skull. So both of these arguments must fail in light of what the evidence actually shows.
When I looked at these films, I was looking at this drawing and I said, in all the meticulous detail, they forgot a fracture down here, right here, which just happens to be at the level that the autopsy doctor said a bullet entered. Not one radiologist who has examined these x-rays for the government has ever mentioned this fracture. And I would like to point out that this just isn't any fracture. I didn't pick a fracture up here or a fracture down there, whatever. Fracture right here, right where the autopsy doctors said a bullet entered. If you read carefully, as I have done through many of the eyewitness testimony, our inspector was questioning Roy Kellerman, a Secret Service agent, who was an eyewitness to the autopsy, and he asked him, what was the distance which separated the large hole at the vertex with the small hole of entry? Roy Kellerman indicated a distance of 2 inches. This is exactly the amount of bone which intervenes between the transverse fracture and the impact point at this higher thing. I don't think Roy Kellerman was hallucinating what he saw. It fits the x-rays and photographs exactly.
Courtesy of the Iraq War, these photographs illustrate for us Puppa's rule, which is that where the skull has been fractured by one impact and then another, the fractures propagated by the second injury will stop where they intersect with the pre-existing fracture lines caused by the first injury. And this can be illustrated, in this case, by bullet holes in a windshield. This is where you see the arrow on the lower left-hand corner of the screen. That is the transverse fracture at the site of the Humes, Boswell, and Fink entry wound as identified by Dr. Robertson, and this fracture has never been mentioned by any of the examiners going back to the original inventorying of the materials by Humes, Boswell, and Fink in January of 1967. What you see, if I can point this out, that white circle there is the site of what was identified by the Clark panel and the HSCA as a roughly 6.5 millimeter round metallic fragment. This was seen the night of the autopsy on the X-rays by Edward Reed, one of the technicians present in the morgue. And then we have the fractures radiating down from that site, which is basically what the Clark and HSCA panels have identified as the site of their wound. We have the fractures radiating down and intersecting with the transverse fracture. And notice something very interesting. This is a detail from a diagram that was drawn by J. Thornton Boswell, one of the pathologists, on the night of the autopsy. It's on the reverse side of his face sheet, and it identifies the 3-4-6 triangular fragment of bone that we see delineated by the fracture pattern that was identified by Dr. Robertson. This is the lateral skull X-ray that was published. There is one that has never been published and remains in the archives. Again, the arrow on the left side of your screen shows the site of the fracture, and Dr. Robertson has said that it is certainly wide enough to accommodate a bullet. Interestingly, you have the so-called cloud of fragments. Here, we don't see any metallic fragmentation at this site, which tells us that the bullet that entered there did not fragment until it exited the skull. By the way, just as an aside, this is a controversial photograph which has been called Fox number 8 by the researchers, and you see this semicircular defect which the majority of the HSCA's forensic pathology panel decided was the exit point for the bullet that entered the rear of the skull. I must say it's obvious to me. I don't know about you, and I fail to see how anyone could have failed to notice it at the bench, although there was never any mention made of it by any of the autopsy pathologists.